Okay everybody, welcome to the grand final of EurOpen 2025. We have two teams in this debate. The team in proposition is USA Red. In opposition, we have Canada Connor McDavid. Then with that, I'll hand over to our grand finals player, Freddie, to lead us through this debate.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the first EurOpen to be held in person since 2019. The first time it's been in Stuttgart since 2018, so thank you everyone who organised this tournament. And in true European fashion, we have teams from America and Canada in the grand finals. Congratulations. My name's Freddie. I'll be the grand final chair for EurOpen 2025. I have, however, 6 lovely panelists who, starting from my left, are Lucas, Dan, Darren, good luck to both of you. But this debate is not about us. This debate is about the speakers. Can we get relative introductions, starting from the team in proposition USA Red? Opposition, Team Canada Connor McDavid.
I'll be the first. Speaking second is doing a slide. Speaking third, Jake.
These speakers have been preparing for the past hour. The motion, this House supports the promotion of collective guilt after large-scale crimes against humanity. So whenever the first speaker of the proposition is ready, we can commence this debate. Hear, hear.
After World War II, there was no real recognition of the crimes that Japan committed in East and Southeast Asia. Thousands of women were raped. Women, children, men, the elderly had chemical weapons tested upon them, and for decades, Japan continues to go unnoticed while the legacies of its imperialism continues. Because this sort of recognition only failed in the absence of collective guilt, we were so proud to stand on side proposition. Just a few things in the speech. First, I'll make some notes of framing. Second, introduce our first 2 substantive arguments. My second speaker will introduce the third. But let's start on a few points of setup. First, what exactly does our side in the promotion of collective guilt look like? Firstly, we think it looks like spreading the idea that conditions in society created the ability for crimes against humanity to happen. Secondly, we think very clearly that there are degrees of guilt, different groups at different levels. Does someone have a time limit when I reset? Third, I think that guilt does not happen in a vacuum. People have to engage because the way this promotion happens is because they see it everywhere, in education, in museums, in history, and in the recognition throughout society. Fourth, I think it's reasonable to say that the guilt doesn't last forever. Over time, when we make corrections and we make changes, we can start to see and recognize different crimes against humanity. But fifth, I think it's very clear that we would never recognize the victims as a need to feel guilty themselves. They are, of course, not the ones who are responsible for these crimes. But secondly, what do crimes against humanity actually look like? We think these large-scale crimes look like things like genocide. They look like the targeting of a massive group of people, of killing innocents in massive wars. But third, what does the counterfactual actually look like? We think it is a world of complacency, of moving on, and failing to recognize the conditions that led to these crimes and repeating them again, such as in Japan. But let's move into our first substantive argument about how collective guilt deters the repeats of these crimes. The thesis here is that only this collective recognition can actually allow people to recognize why the problems happened and prevent them in the future. First layer here. Why are all people have structural barriers on their side of the house that prevent this deterrence? Firstly, we think that mechanistically, that the people who committed these crimes are very unlikely to feel guilt. They are literally people who are willing to go out and massacre and sacrifice thousands of people for the sake of some sort of arbitrary political or military goal. We never thought on either side of the house that they were likely to feel repentance after these massive crimes. Secondly, we think that a lot of people structurally are complacent or somewhat responsible for these crimes through things like doing proxy wars, through things like paying taxes to a government that might have impacted these crimes, or otherwise failing to call out or stand up against this oppression that is happening at their front door. But third, why do we think that the public can oftentimes not be guilty without this encouragement? We think that the status quo shows you a world, largely thanks to the overload of information and the massive attribution of social media that is desensitized and highly individualized without empathy for others. But our second layer, why do we prevent these state crimes? Firstly, we empirically remind people of the severity. Many people, because of that overload, have forgotten just how bad these crimes are, especially when they're not near to them. Second, we think that because of the fact that criminals often don't feel these things, it's important to target the general public and have everyone feel the degree of culpability. Third is the chilling effect. Even if not everyone believes in this collective guilt that's being promoted, the stigma across society will still discourage the repeat of these crimes. Fourth is separation. We prevent the finger-pointing and scapegoating of specific groups when we recognize that all of society plays a role in these crimes. But our third layer, how do they worsen these deterrences? First, we think it's the desensitization. We think that over time and in the status quo, people forget about these things and they start to become normalized. Secondly, we think they lack the moral attachment. When you're purely looking at something, for example, just in the court of law or in the utilitarian lens of how many people died, you lose the intrinsic moral wrongness of what has been committed. But third, we think it allows people to use martyr rhetoric and somehow frame these crimes against humanity as positive things, where they feel like these groups can say, oh, like I'm suffering and in their last stand and in a court of law, I'm the only one responsible, but I did it for a good cause. What then are the impacts? They're very clear. First, on the individual level, much more people are not only aware of the crime, but unlikely to support it in the future. But secondly, on the state and government level, it's much more unlikely that parties in the future can repeat and fall back on these sorts of ideals, and that the new government is able to prevent its reoccurrence. But is there a point before I move on? No. Then let's introduce our second substantive argument about how we achieve more effective prosecution. The thesis here is that, of course, we are allowed, through this collective guilt, the manipulation and call-out of the people who committed their crimes and the appropriate punishment. The first layer is that how their world fails to create this. We think, one, in the status quo, that there's a severe lack of enforcement. International bodies like the ICC lack international recognition, are full of corruption, and are often unrecognized by the very actors who are committing the crimes. Additional bodies like the United Nations lose severity when people like Trump and the Security Council vetoes make them functionally ineffective. But secondly, we think that power structures in their world make it very hard to prosecute. If it's the state harming the people, there's no incentive for the state to be self-corrective. If it's non-state groups, they're likely already powerful enough that the state cannot meaningfully regulate them. If they're interstate wars, there's even less of a reason for states to reinvigorate a war and cross barriers in order to do prosecution. But why on our side do we get better punitive measures? One, we think there's an intrinsic good to condemning the responsibility and recognizing this collective punishment. The guilt in and of itself is a punishment because it's a recognition that there is a crime and retribution. Secondly, the court of public good sets up this system and condition for action that the new state can have public opinion behind them when they go out and condemn these crimes. They have the force of the people behind them, whether this means in votes, in legislation, or just means in the idea of the general public that they will not face as much backlash. Third, we think that it's important for people to understand exactly what the crime is so that there can be a scalar and proportionate punishment. If you do not even recognize the full extent to which the crime against humanity has happened, there is no way that the punishment can be appropriate. Is there a point now?
Sure. You say that evil people will feel guilty no matter how. But these are people who wouldn't feel guilty either way. Why would a blanket policy of collective guilt suddenly make these people better human beings and deter them from committing violence?
I don't think you were listening to the first substantive when I mechanized to you about how those people never change, which is why we have to activate the rest of the public, new states, new parties, and look into the future past those people. But three clear impacts from our second substantive. First, we get more scalar and more proportionate punishments with a true recognition of crime and the public power behind it. Second, we're more likely to actually have the punishment in the first place, as well as it being efficient and timely, rather than long after the people who committed the crimes are gone. Third, we think there's still this principled justification about the condemnation of this responsibility and the recognition of the crimes that has happened. It has never been clear that in the status quo, we have forgotten about the people who are suffering. Both today and yesterday, and for all of tomorrow, we're proud to recognize collective guilt as a promotion against crimes of humanity.
We'd like to thank that speaker for that fantastic speech. And just for audio reasons, if people could be slightly further away from the microphone in future speeches, just for volume purposes, I'd like to invite the first opposition speaker to open the debate for side opposition period.
Am I audible? Should I move back a little bit? Is this good? Okay, great. It was not enough for sides of the opposition to come up and justify why these people should feel guilty by saying that they are complacent. This is not just about punishing people who are directly involved in these crimes. They have to take a higher burden in this debate. That the grandchild of someone who committed a crime like 50 years ago was still accountable and therefore should be guilty on a personal level. With that in mind, I'm going to be doing a few things in this debate. Firstly, I'll be going through framing, then going into refutation and bringing up 2 points on how this is firstly, principally unjustified, and secondly, how it creates more personal resentment within these societies. Firstly then, 5 points of framing. Number 1. We are going to push a burden on society's proposition that they actually have to defend in this debate. They can't just say that people who did crime need to be held criminally liable. This happens on either side of the debate because obviously crimes against humanity are things that courts can persecute. Collective guilt implies that society as a whole needs to feel like responsibility for things that happen, whether or not they're directly involved in this crime. They can try to mitigate out this impact, but obviously that's what this motion is talking about. Secondly, what is collective guilt actually about? Because it's not enough for them to say that, it's like educating about things that happened in the past. Collective guilt is a personal thing that people internalize. That it was your failure and your complacency that caused for the genocide of people in your nation. They have to explain why the personal internalization of bad things that happen is justified on their side. They can't just say education happens. Obviously, education happens on each side of the house. Can't just erase history. Third thing then, they have to justify why specifically governments have the right to do this and, promote collective guilt in the first place. It's not enough to say that collective guilt is good. They have to prove why governments specifically have a right to do this. But then fourthly, what types of policy actually uniquely exist on their side of the house? Because it's deeply, deeply unclear. We think that lots of things still exist on our side of the house. We have immediate reforms like persecuting people who did bad things. We have things like reconciliation measures in place. What we don't have is the suppression of personal guilt for generations and generations that they have to justify. Even if they want to preempt this by saying that this is going to erase maybe 50 years into the future. For those 50 years, they have to justify why this guilt suppressed on people not directly involved in crime was justified in the first place. But lastly, I want to set out criteria for who actually wins this debate. 2 points here. Firstly, we think that the side that ultimately wins this debate is people who are both best for victims, but secondly, best for the country as a whole. And note the weighing of this claim. If your country is unstable, this is lots of social tension. This is not just bad for perpetrators, this is bad for the victims of these societies themselves. They're the ones who have to live in the realities in which people feel resentment against them, with ultimately a very clear ballot for opposition. With that in mind, two pieces of refutation. Firstly, I want to talk about this deterrence mechanism and why it doesn't actually work. Secondly, I want to talk about why persecuting through collective guilt doesn't work either. Firstly then, 2 points on deterrence. They tell you two things. Number one, they say that people were complacent and therefore they are justified in being persecuted. Two reasons why this is not enough to justify this. Number one, the majority of people who were complacent in these conflicts in the first place were subject to a power imbalance. That is to say that you are one average citizen in a nation against a nation as a whole. Therefore, it's deeply unclear what power you had anyway to do something like stand up. I don't know, are you going to go rally government and then get macheted yourself? This is super unclear in the first place. Secondly, we think people have a right to self-preservation. That is to say that if something, you have the right to put your personal interests first because you're the only person who's able to do so. So that means that even if it meant that you were afraid of going to government because you were going to be persecuted, it was still justified for you to do so, even if there was a bad outcome for someone else. But lastly, this is empirically true injustice. We don't persecute people and put them in jail for being complacent in crime. They actually have to be doing the crimes in the first place. This was unjust as a whole. No thank you. Secondly, they say that if people feel guilty, they are not going to repeat the crime. I want to know a crucial piece of framing here. How do people respond to crimes that they know themselves are desensitized to? That is to say that, 50 years down the road, probably unclear to me why I should feel very guilty. So what we feel is not actually guilt. What people feel is resentment. Because if you're so disconnected from the conflict, as they themselves know, then it's very unclear why you have a personal responsibility in the first place. They have to prove a logical link between feeling guilty and between telling people to feel guilty and actually them feeling guilty in the first place. That's an assertion that they're going to have to deal with down the bench. Okay. Secondly, on ineffective policies, I'll integrate that throughout my case. Okay. First argument then on how this is principally unjust. Two criteria you should use to decide if someone is guilty. Firstly, we think that people should have had malicious intent when they did something. But secondly, we think they actively need to be involved in the crime against humanity in the first place. Obviously, this motion suggests that these are people who are not directly involved in these crimes, that society as a whole should be holding these people accountable. So even if we say that people, passively might have benefited from a system in which, bad things happen to other individuals, there's 2 points here. First of all, there's lots of people in these countries who did actually not benefit at all. People immigrate to these nations, and it's to justify why those people should be guilty as well. But secondly, these people were involved in a birth lottery. They didn't choose to be born in a country in which they would benefit off of things like genocide, and therefore it's unclear why they should be held responsible for something they didn't choose in the first place. And this is why the complacency argument doesn't actually work. Because these were people who structurally could have not been actively involved in the first place. These are average citizens who were looking out for themselves when they went out and didn't do something. When they were being passive, they were actually just subject to a power imbalance, which meant they could not do things in the first place. But secondly, we already told you about the right to self-preservation. I'll take you.
Under your logic, if I commit involuntary manslaughter, I should not feel guilty for that. That is a huge offense.
No. This is not about involuntary manslaughter. People who kill people are held accountable on either side of the house. These are people who are, the grandchildren or someone related to someone else who did something. Don't try to, characterize our side of the house wrong. So even if we say that people were, doing bad things on their side of the house, they're being passive, here's why we don't think, this is actually legitimate. First of all, the majority of people who are actually involved in these crimes are dead in the first place because institution building takes 20 to 30 years. But secondly, we told you there were mechanisms to try these people on either side of the house. Don't let them take a low burden on their side. So weigh this claim, even if it means that there is some practical benefit of preventing crime on their side of the house, you are locking up people who don't deserve to be there in the first place. That's ultimately what justice was against. Second argument then on how you create resentment and instability. And note this path to victory. The most important thing for any nation is to create stability as a whole and reintegration of different groups that have historically hated each other. Two reactions from people who actually are forced on collective guilt. Number one, maybe you feel guilty. Like maybe let's say people feel guilty on this side of the house. What is the impact of this? It's quite deeply unclear because they don't actually prove to you the connection between guilt and doing actual things in the first place. Maybe you feel guilty and don't interact with people from the other side of the group. We said that's wrong and bad anyway. But secondly, we told you the much more likely outcome was resentment. Two structural reasons for why this is more likely true. Number one, this is like a power imbalance and top-down approach. That your government is telling you that you should feel a certain way, and so you feel personally attacked. But secondly, as they know themselves, this is like probably quite down the line from the actual thing that happened in the first place. So you feel very desensitized to conflict. It's unclear to you why you should be held responsible for something your grandparents did. So what that means is you feel personally attacked, and you feel like you're a minority in the country, that you feel like you should have rather been accepted. Three things that happen from this that are ultimately harmful. Number one, people become politically radicalized because they don't like parties who frame them as perpetrators in a conflict when they actually are not. Secondly, you have personal conflict with other people from other groups because you blame them for the feelings of guilt that are being pressed upon you when you're trying to resist this in the first place. But lastly, you just teach your kids that oh my god, we're being blamed so unfairly, and that leads to cycles of instability and resentment for groups down the line. Here are the impacts of this. Number one, you have tension between groups. This is terrible for everyone. If you are a victim, if you are a perpetrator, you cannot live peacefully together. That is ultimately the point at which you get all the negative impact you want to claim on their side. But secondly, nation building is harder. That when you cannot have democracy, when you are using justification to disinvolve other groups. Understand at the end of this debate, two things are very clear. Number one, these people are not responsible. But number two, you only got resentment and instability, not integration on their side. Couldn't be more proud to those.
I'd like to thank the first opposition speaker for that fantastic speech, and invite the second proposition speaker to continue their side of the debate. Here.
Opposition would tell you to leave a sinking ship. A ship sinking in the moral debt of atrocity against our own kind, of violence, of rape, and manslaughter. Because we would always choose to imbibe all of those crimes and repair them, then take a breath of fresh air and forget about it. So proud to propose in this debate. Two clashes, then a third sub, but first one note on framing. I think that their framing of collective guilt has been very weird. I think that they tell you, literally in the last speech, that, collective guilt is individual. That is so unintuitive. To tell you that collective guilt is each person individually does not actually match the heart of this motion. We think that when someone is collectively guilty, when a society is collectively guilty, that is looking at the society and saying there were conditions that happened collectively that led to atrocities. I think that their side was vastly away from the motion. But then, on the first clash about the general public and deterring crimes in the future, and I first want to just deal with what makes someone guilty in these atrocities, and their side will tell you that it's intention-based, that if you meant to harm someone, then that it makes you guilty and that anyone else is not guilty. But then first, I think the first response here has to do with Ayush's POI, which is just that there is harms that arise from you not intending to do something, i.e. involuntary manslaughter. You are getting, you need to be punished for those sorts of things, even if you didn't intend for them to happen, because there is still someone that is victimized because of you. There's a necessary justice or a debt that you owe them. Secondarily, we would say that their characterization of our side of the house as saying, people are only complacent because there's a power imbalance is not exactly true. We think that even if you individually have a power imbalance with your government, our characterization of collective guilt isn't that, I should have stopped the government from doing some sort of crazy action and war atrocity and human atrocities. I think that our characterization is more the collective sentiment of the society voted these people into power. The collective sentiment of our society fueled the military strength, all enlisted. We all did these sorts of things in order to allow these conditions to happen. But thirdly, I think if the power imbalance is so severe as they say, we would already tell you that we're not punishing victims in this situation. If I was literally unable to do anything because my government is that oppressive, then those are probably victims of that government in another way. But But fourthly, I would say that even if there's some sort of power imbalance between you and the government, if you are complacent, as they say, then there's still an power imbalance between you and the victims. That means that there is a three-tiered system. There's the government, there are those who are complacent, and there are the victims. That doesn't mean that there was nothing you could have done for the victims. We think that obviously there was something that you could have done, whether it just be an act of compassion. You don't have to be a revolutionary in these situations. Then, they tell you about why, like, they're going to be, like, on their side of the house, like, oh, well, the people who are actually guilty are going to be locked up. I don't think they actually engage with our mechanisms as to why these people are never going to get locked up on their side of the house. They completely let all of these drop. They just tell you, oh, obviously there are courts, there are trials. Those courts and trials are unenforceable. We gave you 3 structural reasons. The first is that those people who commit these atrocities oftentimes don't feel guilt. They're going to double down on their beliefs and do anything to avoid punishment. 2, the reason why they're able to avoid punishment is because these are individuals who are in positions of power. They can circumvent these things. If I start a proxy war with another country, then I, as a global leader, am not going to take responsibility for that war. But thirdly, I think that the public is very desensitized on their side of the house. If I never hear about these things, if I never feel guilty, if I never connect with these issues and say, oh, there was something that I could have done and I feel so empathetic towards these issues, then I'm never likely to actually go out and do something to solve them. But then, I think that our side of the house was much more likely to prevent these things in the future, and I think this very much interacts with their second sub, which they basically tell you that, oh, if you are told that you are guilty for something, then you're going to say, oh, well, I don't want to engage those people like such to such, I'm like desensitized and I hate you now. I think that this first, ignores basic human empathy. If you are told that you are part of a society that enacted massive war crimes, that enacted wars in other countries, that enacted rape and like violence in other countries, I think that the most people would most likely say, oh, I'm going to like feel empathetic, that is so terrible to happen to another human being. But secondarily, I think this is way worse on their side of the house. If you have lesser forms of engagement with an actual crime, then I'm more likely to hear like, oh, like numbers on a page, this ethnic group did something to this ethnic group. That means that you're flattening the issues on their side of the house and you're less likely to feel sympathetic because there's still going to be some base level of like guilt, even if it's not actually promoted on their side of the house. So that means you're more likely to get that guilt on their side of the house and then reject it because you don't actually know the details of the circumstances that happen. Only on our side of the house are you actually reminded of the severity. Are you actually reminded that there were actual people who died? These are not numbers on a page, they were actual people. But then, upstream of all their material, they dropped a crucial mechanism on our side of the house, and that has to do with the chilling effect. Even if you don't personally believe that you're guilty, even if you don't personally agree, even if you end up hating the victims of these sorts of atrocities, we thought the chilling effect operated upstream because you're not encouraged to say or do anything. If you live in a society that is so collectively opposed, where all of your education, your museums, your curriculums are all fully supporting the cause of trying to repair for previous injustices, then I think that it was very likely that you're way less likely to actually say anything against that collective sentiment. You were much more uncompelled to do so. But on their side of the house, you never got that. On their side of the house, you were way more likely to have those crimes in the future because people doubled down. If you're guilty on their side of the house, you're more likely to enact some sort of martyr rhetoric, but I'll take the POI.
You're literally contradicting your own case. If this is not a personal feeling that people have to internalize, why are they still not going to be desensitized?
Yeah, if this is not a personal feeling that I have to internalize, but I'm still looking at like atrocities that my society committed, then I'm more likely to engage with the material on our side of the house when it's actually put in front of me to look at. If I have museums, if I have curriculums, if I have textbooks that tell me about these things. Secondarily, they entirely didn't engage with our second sub about punishment of people who are actually guilty. They only talk about the punishment of people who they say are not guilty, but we would say if you're directly involved, you only get punished on our side of the house because courts don't enforce these things. Only when you're actually able to put people in, only when you are able to force the general public to engage with these crimes are they actually given the knowledge to actually punish who is responsible and force themselves to engage with these issues. Then, a third sub about international reparation. The thesis here is that when the sentiments of societies match the sentiments outside of societies regarding feelings of who is culpable for atrocities, you are more likely to build international networking and you're more likely to have better democratic structures. First layer then about internal democratic structures. We think that external nations on our side of the house will see internal sentiments that align with the international perception questions of guilt. If our entire society says we are guilty for these things, and the rest of the world says you are guilty for these things, that is an alignment that forges better relations. That means that countries are way more likely to enact aid or new systems of governance. They're more likely to trust these new governments on our side of the house and build relationships with them. This is better in the long term for these countries because it allows them to keep these democratic structures. Second layer then, about external reparative obligations. On our side of the house, we're more likely to feel domestic internal pressure to build a better international standing because you recognize that your international standing is very bad right now. That means there's more pressure for these nations to act credibly, but this was uniquely key and the impact here was uniquely important because it counterbalanced other aggressive actors. When there were situations where war crimes were going to happen from other actors, we thought these nations who had more of a moral responsibility were more compelled to build their international credibility by stopping these actors from doing such atrocities. We prevented atrocities in the future and gave justice to those who were left behind. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that fantastic speech, and invite the second speaker of opposition to continue the case recital. Hear, hear.
Okay, let me just pull up the timer now. Okay. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. My great-aunt was a little girl when the Nanjing massacre occurred, and yet her ancestors, many, many years back, also committed mass murders. We think across history, people rotate between guilt and shame and hatred and violence, victim and perpetrator. Opposition ends this cycle of violence. We're very proud to oppose. There's going to be a few things in the speech. First, we're going to push proposition's real burden onto them because we don't think they defend it. And then two themes. First, on whether this is actually fair. Secondly, whether this is beneficial for reconciliation healing. And the third argument, how this allows governments to escape accountability. First step, let's push proposition's real burden onto them because we don't think they defend it. This is not about societies like Japan who wouldn't have implemented any kind of guilt or any kind of reparations in any case, right? This looks like societies where alternatives do exist. So if a country is able to implement something so extreme as collective guilt, then on our side of the house, they have to implement less extreme versions, things like education, things like alternatives saying that our country did something wrong, that people can still read about it in textbooks and learn about it in school and those things, and still feel empathy, crucially, for those people who are victims of those things. And notably, this is because within a country there is a memory of what happened, and so there is an impetus to have educational reform. And so what proposition must do is they must take a higher burden, that it must be an assignment of personal responsibility, that it isn't just our country 40 years ago did something bad, it is that your ancestor did it, and that you should feel directly, personally guilty for those actions. First theme then on whether this is principally justified or not, without proving that it is fair to do this to those people, no matter the practical benefits, proposition already loses. We say it is justified, and we agree with them, no thank you, to prosecute truly guilty people. So people who actually committed murder, even people who committed manslaughter, right, are persecuted under the law. This looks like the Nuremberg trial, which we also agree happened on our side of the house. But we say that most of the people they prosecute on their side of the house are not guilty. Why is this? One, the people who are truly evil are not affected by collective guilt. Those are people who committed massive human rights violations. Those people aren't affected. And so the individuals who are most affected are two cases. One, that these people often weren't there. That in many cases, in order to reestablish institutions in a post-conflict society, it takes 40 years to implement something like collective guilt, which means that the people who actually experienced it are people who weren't directly there at the time of conflict and were not direct perpetrators of that crime. Secondly, even if it occurs very, very quickly, these are likely people who didn't do the action in and of itself, because we don't think that massive amounts of people are committing crimes. We think it's a small number of very powerful people leading on a society. But even if they were complacent, listen to their reasoning as to why people are complacent. They say people are guilty because they pay taxes to a guilty government. Mussolini in World War II era Italy stole people's grandma's gold rings off of their fingers, right? Your grandma's not going to commit tax evasion and face getting riddled by bullets by the secret police. So we think in cases you are obligated to defend other people if it causes you no personal harm. So I can save a child who is drowning if it causes me no personal harm. But if I'm going to drown too, and if the child drowning was like 40 years ago, I don't think I should feel guilt for not saving the child who was drowning 40 years ago. No thanks. Here's why it is different from manslaughter then. These people, we told you, and this crucially was not responded to, these people are structurally prevented from acting. There is a massive power imbalance. The reasoning for this, if it was such a massive crime, there was likely some powerful group or state perpetrating these. And so there's state oppression, right? So these people, if you speak up, you become an enemy of the state as well. But even if this isn't true, people are irrationally fearful. These are moments where there is chaos and instability. They are often indoctrinated by state media and propaganda, and information, the flow of information is often suppressed. So this is why they don't speak up, and this is why they're not culpable. No thanks. These people deserve to be educated. We do that too. In fact, we think we owe them the truth, but they do not deserve to feel guilt. Second theme on why it is beneficial, but sure, I'll take you.
Yeah, obviously, if you're so pressed by your government that you could get killed for speaking up, then you are probably a victim of that government too. This motion was not...
Okay, this motion assigned guilt very, very arbitrarily in a very black and white form. Hutus were often killed in Rwanda as well, and yet guilt was assigned to them, right? So victims and perpetrators, they are never black and white, they are never clear. We thought this was unjust. Second theme on why this is actually beneficial for reconciliation. We are able to co-opt their benefits through things like TRCs and education. We told you that already. Why is their side ineffective? We told you that people who are experiencing collective guilt have very, very little power. Even if they're well-educated and feel deeply empathetic, they only have one vote a year that they would rather spend on something else, and they have limited financial capacity to actually take action. But even if it is effective, they never adjust or flip, which is what Brooke told you on our first, that it produces resentment and counter-violence. The perpetrator group, and notably, this perpetrator group is never clear. Often Hutus in the Rwandan genocide were killed too if they experienced that, right? They too suffered, often under oppression that led to the outburst of violence in the first place. For example, Tutsis dominating the Rwandan government and oppressing Hutus before the genocide actually happened, right? So this is why those things are deeply ambiguous. And so the black and white assignment of guilt, one, assigns guilt to people who feel like they should not be persecuted, and two, it ignores these structural issues. So French tells you that this results in massive amounts of anger, especially because in post-conflict societies, former perpetrators often become the minorities, and then they feel deeply subjugated by the state. This radicalizes them and causes them to have outbursts of violence. Secondly, the victim group is constantly reminded of the violence that happened. We said that this also created resentment. And so there's two impacts. So even if this doesn't happen, we say this also prevents the society from healing, because we thought that the best way for society to heal was the reintegration of those groups, right? So that people don't see differences, that I feel comfortable sitting in parliament together, or the sons of Hutus and Tutsis can sit together in a park and not feel anger towards each other. So even if second prompt is right, that people feel viscerally awful and empathetic, this is a bad thing. So healing is impossible when a group is deeply uncomfortable and unable to reintegrate. Finally, on our second argument, why does this allow governments to evade accountability, even if their policy works incredibly well? Collective guilt pushes responsibility onto the people, often people who are somewhat detached, as we told you already. It emphasizes personal accountability. It looks like land acknowledgement in Canada and New Zealand and Australia. This is ineffective for the reasons we already told you, that people are disconnected over time, that they're not the correct people to make the changes, and that is often just deeply performative. More importantly, it displaces attention from governments and institutions, that it reduces our desire to see change, and this will clash with them, because we believe the government has done enough. They say the state is not self-corrective, but the state is pressured by the people into action if people believe that it isn't doing enough, right? But now people are satiated by things like land acknowledgements. Now people feel, what more do I have to give? Why does this matter? Two reasons. One, the government is the biggest perpetrator of these crimes. Make no mistake, it is not the common people. The Catholic Church that led conquest into and funded residential schools, governments that snatched kids from their homes, and the police force, these are the institutions with the capacity and who did do the massive harm. Secondly, the government has capacity to do the biggest changes, things like paying reparations. Thirdly, the government now has an excuse to continue to oppress these people, to continue to oppress the indigenous and force them onto reserves, for example, because the will of the people for change has fizzled out. We're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the second opposition speaker for that fantastic speech, and invite the third proposition speaker to continue the debate for South Prop here.
The biggest problem with side opposition in this debate is their lack of mechanization of their counterfactual. What do they defend? They have consistently shifted their ground from very little mechanization in the 01 to then in the 02 trying to run through the middle desperately because they know we were ahead on why their arguments were insufficient. At that point, we are very proud to propose. What can you expect in this speech? Two main clash areas, first on deterrence and second on the principle of being guilty. First clash then on deterrence. Our argument is simple. The education and stigma of war crimes prevents these crimes from being replicated in the future on our side. What was their best response to this argument? It takes a long time to institute this collective guilt. Did you hear any mechanization why this was true? Absolutely not. We say that the media can still push these narratives. Also, never proven why it has to be the government, by the way. That was just an assertion as well. They've never proven why this was true. It is possible for you to be able to push this collective narrative quickly. But also, even if this wasn't true, I have no idea why this implicates our argument. It can still be true that we deter crimes in the future if people know that historically in the past it was the societal guilt that gave rise to these things. That is something that was unique to our side. Their burden stuff about how people, about the alternative, like being like, oh, we can still get education on our side, is just a desperate running to the middle. How this does not knife your case, if you're saying that we should still try to push things down people's throats, how does that not create the same resentment that you were talking about? It was contradiction after contradiction from side opposition. What was their best response to this argument? Oh yeah, their argument about resentment best interacts with this. We had interacted with both of the structural reasons why resentment was not likely to exist in our world that never much interacted with in the op2. First, they tell you about a power imbalance, about how this, but this again was not the government. We told you that there existed things like culture, the media, etc., which meant that this power imbalance that they talked about did not exist in all instances. But also, they say that the people down the line will end up feeling like they relate with this. But again, our argument is not about personal guilt. This motion is talking about collective guilt, which we have defined in framing. It was an understanding that our society gave rise to these kinds of things that received no engagement from side opposition. Again, this argument doesn't matter. But even then, for them to win this, they have to prove three things in the round. They have done none of them. First, they have to prove that people actually end up expressing these ideals and resentment on their side. Second, they have to prove that this was better than the comparative. And third, they have to prove that the radicals on their side are worse than our side. Here's why they do none of that. First, about people expressing this. My opponents have not responded to our argument about the chilling effect. Our argument is that even if you give them their highest ground and say that maybe people have resentment, they are afraid to express these sentiments because they know that in their society has demonized it or they have collective guilt surrounding this. This is very logical. You can do the incentive analysis. If I speak out in a society that has created this narrative and I get demonized, then it's obviously something that they don't want to do, which means that on our side they are most likely to acquiesce. Also, even if you give them their highest ground on this argument, I don't see why the majority of people now have this resentment against this collective narrative. That is still a continuation of the promotion of this narrative, if anything, that is no longer in the bounds of this motion. Second thing they had to do was prove that this was better than the comparative. Literally no work done on why this resentment was worse. Here's why it isn't. Remember that in our world where there is no ability to tell or create this narrative that this was bad, we think that more radicals are able to rise quicker in their world. But also, this structural reason for this is because they are now able to glorify the time period in which these war crimes happened, which then allows them to weaponize this rhetoric to make things even worse. And, most importantly, on their counterfactual, is that there is no guilt assigned to people. So what do you get? You get finger pointing from different groups to other groups, saying that no, you should feel guilty, you should feel guilty. And what this ends up doing is creating even more resentment on their side. Our comparative is that if everybody shares this guilt, that was uniquely good. Also, remember from our third substantive that we told you that this was key to establishing democratic institutions. So even if you get the rise of radicals in their side, they are able to be ousted, whereas in their world where there is autocracy, it is impossible to do so. That was clear for us. But third, even if they win this argument about how there are radicals who get into power, they have not recognized why these were specifically worse, which was the third burden that they failed to prove. If anything, there is less magnitude of these groups. And the reason for this is because there's some level of stigmatization against some of the things that these groups do. Even if I have resentment against maybe the demonization of one specific ethnic group, there are still specific things like war crimes or chemical weapons that can still get demonized on our side, which is created through the collective guilt that still responds. Also, if nothing else you take away from this clash, our substantive 3 received 0 engagement in their last speech, and it talks about how these countries who suffered war crimes are more likely to be more active on the international stage to promote things like democracy and prevent war crimes. Meaning, even if you buy all of their arguments that in the country resentment grows, there are more countries who have less war crimes on our side, which means even if you buy 100% of their offense, we still win, never interact with. I want to hear responses to that in their next speech. This operates upstream of the principle in this round. We are willing to accept that we can tell that some people who technically aren't guilty under their principle can be considered guilty, if that means that you were able to prevent these war crimes from existing again, because that was just such a high magnitude impact. Before I move on to my second clash, I'll take points.
This is a fundamental misunderstanding of how radicalization happens. The chilling effect creates radicalization. That's where you get radical Facebook groups who are so angry that they can't speak about like their feelings.
Yeah, so number one, I've already done the incentive analysis to you why due to this chilling effect, they're unlikely to do so and acquiesce because they know they'll be demonized by society. But two, even if we take you at your highest ground, our argument is that they end up not even being in power for long, and it gets worse on your side because there's more finger pointing between the groups. These were all arguments that I made in my speech. Interact with that. Second clash then is about this principle of being guilty. Our argument is simple. We are able to prosecute war criminals on our side. They have not responded to any of the comparative analysis, specifically the argument about the state. Our argument is in their side of the house, where the state is the one perpetuating these crimes, there is no incentive for the state to prosecute them. Whereas on our side, if the collective guilt is shared, primarily among the government, by the way, per framing, which interacted directly with their substantive 3, it means that we are more likely to see this on our side. Look, just the lack of engagement with this argument, they just try to hand-wave it away by saying that we get prosecution on our side too, with zero mechanization why this is true. They dropped all of the comparative analysis why they don't get the same level of prosecution. I think their Nuremberg trial example actually works for us. What was their principle though? I think this principle was actually just a nothing burger. Their own argument is about like malicious intent about how we should not be held culpable for it. We explained to you why this is extremely illogical. Because there are things that you do that do not have malicious intent that still create bad harms that we believe you should be held culpable for. How many people have to die in the Middle East before people in the United States know that their tax dollars are going to an oppressive government? We always thought that should be deemed, that there should be collective guilt on our side. But even then, even if we agree with their argument that yes, they participated in a society, which means you can assign some level of guilt to them, yes, it is true that the government is against you. But number one, our framing told you that we should not be having guilt against the victims, which means this argument didn't interact. But two, we told you that this was not a personal demonization, or it was not a personal guilt. It was rather about the society as a whole, which means this argument didn't respond. Also, I think this argument that they make that we jail a bunch of innocent people just isn't responsive. Like, it's not like our side defends that all these people, everybody within a society just gets thrown into jail. This is such an uncharitable characterization by team opposition that it didn't make much sense. This debate is broken down simply. The most important argument from our side is our argument about deterrence. We prevent the crimes that they talk about from being replicated in the future. This is a magnifier of their principle. If it is true that you get more of these crimes on their side, it means that more people end up being falsely accused of being guilty, etc. We also thought that the magnitude of this was significant. All of their arguments are not in the context of specifically the comparative. They do not have a counterfactual in any of their arguments. So I prove to you that our comparative side is better at preventing these crimes from being in the future, and the conceded argument about how this gets multiplied internationally, this should be enough to vote for side proposition.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that fantastic speech, and invite the third speaker of side opposition to continue the case for side op. Here.
Am I good to start? Okay, cool. I'll get started in 3, 2. Following the Holocaust, the world said, never again. Yet again and again throughout history, the same types of violence become perpetuated. The reason why is not because there's a lack of deterrence, but that the guilt is misplaced. And this guilt is manifest, it festers, it causes more violence to the same groups today that the other side so wants to help. For those reasons, we are incredibly proud to oppose. What am I going to be talking about? 1, what do we support? 2, how does collective guilt manifest? And what are the degrees of separation that exist under their side house? And then 3 main themes. 1, are these people
complacent, and i.e. should they feel bad? And two, which is better for the victims? Lastly, on nation-building efforts and this bizarre last-ditch attempt on this idea of the international state. Firstly then, what do we support? We support examples like Cambodia, in which there is a collective moving forward, right? That this terrible thing happened, but we are collectively as a nation moving forward. We will rectify the inequalities of the past, but we will not say that we are all collectively guilty, that we have made good progress, and that we ought to continue to in the future. We have no response to this characterization except to say, well, how would this even work? We told you how this was going to work. We heard no response. Obviously, these conflicts are incredibly complicated, and what the other side does is to reduce them to black and white. Either you are guilty or you're a victim, and some analogous force in the world will tell you which one you are. We think that is not the reality that exists in the status quo. How does collective guilt manifest? We told you numerous things. One, that individuals make up a society, that unless the only way that you get individuals to care is if you tell them that they're individually responsible. The way that you get collective guilt is if all the individuals individually also feel responsible. If there's a broad, boring academic language that they say, that you teach children, well, your government 40 years ago did this really, really bad thing, I doubt anyone would really care, and their deterrence thing doesn't really work, right? They need to prove why this strong visceral reaction would in fact change things. We think they have failed to do so. I would also like to note that there are differences between feeling sympathetic and feeling guilty. I can feel sympathetic for the terrible, terrible thing that happened 40 years ago. That does not mean that I feel guilty or that my nation is personally responsible. That we can rectify all the harms that exist, that there can be immediate reparation. But under their side of the house, they have not proven why this is not the case. The last thing I want to note is this idea of degrees of separation. They think only the people that will do bad things will be caught. Then why can't we just make those people feel bad? Like, they need to prove why every single person in that society ought to feel a sense of collective guilt. They have failed to do so. Obviously, this idea of collective guilt is applied uniformly if they say it applies to the media and to education. That means every single person traveling through the education system will learn of this narrative, and the way that it manifests currently is to say that you are responsible. And they say this themselves through all the taxes things, right? That you pay taxes, and as a result, you're complacent, which I don't even think is that convincing. Alright then, what does this likely look like? Here's what we explain. The guilt you feel is over that specific event. This idea of never again doesn't exist under their side of the house. You feel bad for the specific thing that happened 40 years ago. That doesn't stop literally any other country in the status quo from not perpetuating the same violence. Countries that commit genocide in the past ship regularly weapons to other nations to perpetuate proxy wars. Their own example and the reality that we live in does not support their own analysis. Alright then, first, and the last thing is like, these states probably feel fairly sympathetic towards reconciliation anyways. If it is the case that they are incredibly hateful and they will just deny that it existed, I seriously doubt they would do this collective guilt thing. Either it's not a policy mission, you would not force a country in order to do this. Alright then, what are these people complacent, and as a result, should they feel bad? Here are the types of people that we are talking about that they fail to engage with. The vast majority of people, they're entirely separated from the conflict. Looks like children, looks like immigrants, looks like people who literally were not alive when that conflict happened. What do they say to those people? Well, you are still complacent because, involuntary manslaughter. But that's not the example here. The example here is if I, during a conflict, held a gun to your head and said, go kill these 5 people, or I will kill you and your entire family. That is the things that we're talking about. We think that in the law, if you force someone, no thank you, to do an action, you yourself will not be charged. We think this is fairly intuitive because you had no choice in the matter, you had no consent, no free will. We think we punish people on the actions that they choose to take, not the things that they actually end up doing. That is just the way the law is. We think that many of the times these bystanders are paralyzed from taking action. They are incredibly fearful. And their only response is, well, they're victims too. Well, then everyone is a victim in a conflict, right? And this is probably true. But the way that collective guilt works is that you have to pick a specific group where you say, we did these bad things, or the state did bad things against this group. Or it doesn't make sense to say that the German state 40 years ago perpetuated, really bad things against the Nazis. Obviously, this is about a specific group of people. The second thing then is for them to say, well, you pay taxes, so you're complacent. We told you don't pay to choose, you don't pay to be born a German, you don't pay to be born a Cambodian. The only thing you can do is pay taxes, or you'd be sent to jail. And this weighing-wise applies to the vast majority of people who have virtually nothing to do, not even your ancestors, right? You don't even know who these people are. You somehow still have to feel very accountable. Look, in their first speech, they literally concede that this guilt is a punishment. Why are we punishing people that had no role in this conflict at all? We think this is quite terrible. This is awful. Here's the strategy of this theme in the round. None of our content works about quote-unquote deterrence. In this case, people literally have nothing to do with it. They probably will have nothing to do with it in the future. They do nothing to actually break down the institutions that cause this violence. And in fact, we make those institutions under their side way weaker. When you villainize this guilt, when you tell people you ought to feel guilty even when they are confused, to ask no questions, to have this be a taboo topic when you discuss whether or not you are truly accountable and why you ought to be truly guilty. The second theme prosecuted. They make this sound like we just made this up, right? But Milosevic was prosecuted. All 7 people that were responsible in orchestrating the Rwandan genocide are currently in the ICC or the ICJ, currently negotiating this. We think that we catch them. But the second thing, they say, well, the state internally will try to catch them. The whole point of why these institutions exist is because after a conflict, after a genocide, the state has no capacity to catch them. After the Rwandan genocide, there were 7 lawyers in all of Rwanda total. It is likely the case that under either side of the house, it is in fact international organizations that catch these people. We don't think these international organizations get more or less effective in that country, 40 years later, happens to feel much more guilty. We told you 4 things under why this is better for victims. 1, we've told you that you fundamentally lack true understanding under their side of the house, that you make these issues incredibly taboo to discuss, that when you are in Germany, you say, I don't know if I was truly responsible for the Holocaust. Everyone makes fun of you, right? Everyone says, look at the media, look at education, you were obviously wrong, you were obviously evil, you should feel personally complacent. We think this is incredibly bad. They actually isolate people to become numbers more. But when you feel really, really awkward talking to a person that was a victim of a genocide because you feel really guilty. When I say something mean to my friend, I feel guilty and I act weird around them, right? But the whole point is that we have to integrate. We have to bring these people into society and say, look, we understand this terrible thing happened to you. We have to move on as a collective. They failed to respond to these arguments. Second thing then, on this idea of resentment, we told you that resentment was being built because there was a top-down approach that happened. What if we hear under their side of the house, oh, well, it's not necessarily government, so the top-down idea of being oppressed isn't true. It literally is, because the government is the only ability to have this capacity to influence education, to influence what is allowed on the media. Obviously, that is why, for instance, here it is illegal to have Holocaust denial, yet there is an increasing amount of neo-Nazism in the future. We told you that this rise of resentment wasn't just fake, people just felt resentment and they moved on. It meant that they supported less policies that help the people that exist right now in this present world. That is the harm that exists under their side of the house that they have failed to weigh against. Maybe they provide an ideological retribution for the people that died 60 years ago, but they do absolutely nothing for the people right now. In fact, you tell them that they deserve to feel fully isolated, that they ought to be the victims, even if they have moved on. We think that is incredibly problematic. Alright then, lastly, we told you that the policy was just likely going to be really bad, that it's performative, right? You do things like land acknowledgements that don't meaningfully change your life because you as the government are trying to quote-unquote feel guilty. Does it actually help these people move forward? We told you again and again, the answer was no. Dealing with their last idea is this idea of the international stage, we think many countries will do this under either side of the house. Presumably you don't want to be caught with a genocide. Even if you do feel more or less guilty, you probably do want to decrease genocide in the future as a whole. But we told you when it comes to building democratic institutions, such as in Rwanda, such as in Cambodia, it is impossible to do so when you artificially create those divisions. For those reasons, incredibly proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the third opposition speaker for that fantastic speech, and now invite the opposition reply speaker to conclude this debate recital period.
My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Let's look past Team USA's jargon. At this point, I still don't understand why we're uncomparative. I still don't even know what a magnifier of principle is. Opposition in this debate was very, very clear in our language. Innocent people do not deserve to be punished. So I'm going to do a few things in this speech. First, we're going to prove how we win this weird meta-debate battle as to what collective guilt looks like. And then we'll do 2 themes. Why? One, why this isn't just. Secondly, why this isn't effective. First then, USA really likes these meta-debate battles, so we'll engage with them. Their reputation is this. This isn't individual guilt, and this is collective guilt. But from their side, I still don't understand what collective guilt means. They never define it. Structurally and empirically, we told you certain things were symmetric, that the law exists in every country, and that people who commit murder will always be prosecuted and put in jail. Secondly, that history books and textbooks exist, that education systems exist in these countries, that we can educate people to a sufficient degree, and people can feel sympathy in their hearts to a certain degree. Secondly, that human memory, thirdly, that human memory exists on both sides of the house. And so we told them again and again to defend the burden that they shied away from. The collective guilt, the word guilt, is when people feel it individually, and that is what causes harm. First thing then on whether this is just. We said that this was logically prior to everything they told you about practicality.
We are willing to be the team in this debate that actually takes on a trade-off. We can bite the bullet and say we get less reparations, sure, but we would rather let bystanders go free than let innocent people feel guilt. We thought that that was the worst impact in this debate. Notably, they agree with us. They told us in a third that the state is culpable. And then they say the state won't persecute itself because the state isn't self-corrective, so we should satisfy our bloodlust by punishing the common innocent man instead. Notably, this was so bad because this wasn't even just innocent people. We told you out of our first, these were victims too. That these were people who were oppressed by their states as well. These were people who were aggressively taxed in order to fund Italy's massive war effort. These were people who were paralyzed by fear in a society of chaos and instability. These are the reasons why those people did not take up arms, sacrifice their lives for something that they thought was intangible, for a cause they thought they could not fix. We thought that those people were innocent, they did not deserve to be punished. Secondly, let's engage with the theme that they actually try to win, which is whether this is effective or not. Let's note their assertions. If I feel mildly guilty for crimes committed 40 years ago by my country, somehow my state, which is, according to them, also evil, will now be an international beacon for human rights and lead the charge for other countries as well. But the state can't be evil on our side of the house and malleable and kind and compassionate on theirs. Hopefully, proposition reply will pick a side. We then told you the structural reasons as to why accountability actually dissolves. We thought that proposition in this debate distracted from the true perpetrator. It was not the common man who may have been complacent, who may have been paralyzed by fear. It was the state who funded massive amounts of violence. It was the state who set up a secret police. It was the church who snatched people from their homes, funded residential schools, and enslaved indigenous children. We thought that that was the true perpetrator. And so we thought that in perpetrating the innocent man, our natural inclination for justice would fizzle out and would dissolve, and that was why accountability for the true perpetrators dissolved. But even if guilt is effective, they never refuted what we told you about resentment. They say that there are degrees of victimhood. Maybe only my dad died and your whole family died. I shouldn't be punished more, even if you suffered more. When that happens, I feel resentment, and secondly, and more effectively, I feel massive discomfort. This never went refuted either. And there is still an out-group and an in-group. There is still an us versus them. We told you throughout this debate that a new state is fragile. We ought not break that precious peace and divide that state again. We're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition reply speaker for that fantastic speech, and to conclude this debate as a whole, I'd like to invite the proposition reply speaker here.
I'll use simple language to explain a clear stance. Genocide, slaughter, and rape. They have never engaged once with our mechanisms about how they never achieve prosecution, and certainly not deterrence, because they fail to do the real comparative. Let's go through the two key deciders of your ballot. First is the question of prosecution and the principle. Second is deterrence and armed collapse. But let's quickly take out their idea on the principle. There are a few things that they had to prove that they never did. Firstly, they had to prove that all the people that we find guilty are innocent. Secondly, they had to prove that these people literally get jailed beyond just recognizing the problems in society. Third, in all of their 56 minutes, they still have not provided a bright line as to when the guilt, knowledge, and recognition overlap into violating their principle. We also told you from the one that fundamentally collective guilt is different than individualism, not just because it has different degrees of culpability, but because it recognizes conditions in society which created the problems so that it lasts long into the future. It also fundamentally avoided these problems of scapegoating because it recognizes that different people play different roles in the problems. But what did we give you strongly on prosecution? We told you that we acknowledge that governments are flawed. We acknowledge that bad actors don't want to reconcile with their actions, which is why we empower the public to collectively recognize why these things happen, what exactly happened, so that they can not only, one, pressure these flawed states into action, but also pressure non-state actors. They talk continuously about the state, but it's not always the state that's inciting these violence. But furthermore, all 56 minutes of this debate, they still have not not responded to the mechanisms of international checkback. We tell you the existing mechanisms, like the ICJ, like the rule of law, empirically failed. And education will not happen without the recognition that everyone had a part to play. Ayush in the 3, as well as Gia in the 2, told you about how not only do international nations help those states do the prosecution, they call for democracy, but also that long term, it creates deterrence, which leads perfectly into the second clash. This always up-layers the principle, because not only do we think that we should prioritize victims, but that in the long term, if we can prevent atrocities, if we can both protect the innocent and protect the guilty, this was most important in the round. We told you empirically through all 3 of our substantives that it was always more true that that our side created a much better long-term analysis. A few things here. Firstly, we've told you that we've already taken down your argument about radicalism because their 12 minutes of the oblast didn't answer any of the 3 burdens Ayush set. 1, they have to explain why these people always express harmful sentiments when society creates the stigma that makes them not or less incentivized to do this. Second, they had to prove it's worse than comparative. And third, they had to prove that the radicals actually get worse. They don't give you the counterfactual, and they never answer the fact that scapegoating and finger-pointing on their side hurts these people much more radical when you're still telling them the problem, but that only they're the problem. We recognize that everyone in society collectively shares this burden, which makes them feel less targeted and less radical because we know that everyone plays a role. But we told you empirically that on the individual, on the national, and on the international level, we fundamentally outweigh. Because not only do other countries tell this country to be more democratic, the country goes out and in the future they help other countries commit less crimes and atrocities, but we also give you very specific mechanisms about how these people fundamentally can even recognize the severity and the scale of the crime in the first place. We thought it was very explicitly clear that sure, even if we're really, really charitable, and you grant them that, for example, like some people are unjustly punished, that we would prioritize punishing the true perpetrators, and that in their best case scenario, in which maybe in the short term there's a little bit of backlash, that long term the norm setting and the precedent that we create not only enables a more stable country, but a more stable world. It has never been more true that we need collective guilt. Proud of our folks.
I'd like to thank the proposition group led for a fantastic speech. Myself and the other judges are going to resign and come up with a decision, hopefully within 30 minutes. One final applause for everyone in this debate.
Thank you, everybody. We will have a quick break until 20:30, 20 minutes. Until 20:30. Thank you.
I'm not going to relitigate what was said in this final because we all saw it, and I wouldn't be able to explain it better than they did. So congratulations to the teams, both teams in the finals, who both did a tremendous job. Judging with me, my excellent panelists, Dan, Darren, Livia, Lucas, Myrtle, and Rhea. We all agreed this was a good debate, but we did not all agree on who won the debate. And after a long and constructive discussion about how the debate went, we arrived at a 4-3 split decision. With the chair in the majority, that the champions of EurOpen 2025 were the team in opposition.